Dawn crept over the shattered French countryside on June 7, 1944. The morning mist clung to burned-out hedgerows, and the distant rumble of engines rolled like thunder through the low clouds. German field marshals gathered around a flickering radio inside a commandeered farmhouse near Saint-Lô, their faces lit by the trembling glow of a single lantern. The reports were disjointed, fragmented, impossible. Entire divisions had vanished overnight. Panzers sent toward the coast never returned. The channels were full of desperate voices, commands swallowed by static, confusion, and disbelief. The invasion they had feared for years had come, and it was worse than they imagined. From the beaches to the fields, the earth itself trembled beneath the mechanical rhythm of an unstoppable tide. Thousands of landing craft had surged across the English Channel, each carrying soldiers who seemed to rise endlessly from the sea. Behind them, a grey armada of steel filled the horizon. 5,000 ships under the command of Admiral Bertram Ramsay, delivering men and machines with machine-like precision. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was nowhere to be seen. Its fuel depots lay in ruins, its squadrons scattered. The sky belonged to the Americans now, and they ruled it with the confidence of an empire that had learned how to manufacture victory. Along the hedgerows, the defenders of the Wehrmacht fought like cornered wolves. They were veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, men hardened by years of killing. Yet the scale of what they faced defied belief. American columns moved with terrifying coordination, infantry, tanks, engineers, and air support woven together in perfect choreography. When the Germans tried to regroup, a P-47 Thunderbolt would scream down from the clouds and tear their positions apart with machine gun fire. When they counterattacked, they were met with artillery barrages so precise it seemed as if the gunners could see through the earth itself. Every attempt to stem the advance was smothered before it began. By midday, reports reached Army Group B headquarters that the Americans had established 5 beachheads and were pouring supplies ashore faster than any counterattack could be mounted. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, was summoned from his car to the operations table. He traced his finger over the map, following the arrows of Allied penetration. Behind those arrows were not just men, but industry, planning, and an energy of mobilization the German mind had never truly understood. Rommel had once written that battles were won by spirit, by the will to fight, by the cunning of commanders. But as he studied the reports, he realized something had changed. Spirit alone could no longer win a modern war. Far to the west, at the port of Cherbourg, a platoon of American engineers worked through the night under artillery fire. They were building roads before the front had even stabilized, laying steel mesh over mud so trucks wouldn't sink as the rain began again. Each soldier was a cog in a colossal mechanism that never stopped moving. Every bullet fired, every tank refueled, every casualty evacuated, followed a system so vast that no German officer could comprehend its full scope. The Americans had turned war into logistics, and logistics into a weapon. In Berlin, the High Command tried to maintain composure. Propaganda broadcasts assured the nation that the Western invasion would be repelled within weeks. Yet behind closed doors, the generals argued bitterly. One compared the situation to the Eastern Front before Stalingrad, except this time there would be no winter to halt the enemy. Another warned that the Americans were not like the British. They fought with a detached relentlessness, a mechanical patience that made them seem more machine than man. And when the first reconnaissance photos arrived, showing mile after mile of ships anchored off Normandy, even the most loyal staff officers fell silent. It was a sight beyond calculation. On the ground, captured German soldiers spoke in disbelief. They described enemy units that seemed endless, fresh faces rotating through the lines while German battalions dwindled. They had seen tanks that refueled and returned to battle within hours, and trucks filled with supplies appearing as if conjured from thin air. The prisoners whispered to one another that perhaps the Americans had found a way to make soldiers faster than the Germans could kill them. In a sense, they weren't far from the truth. The heart of that unstoppable momentum lay thousands of miles away, in factories across Michigan, Ohio, and California. There, under the fluorescent glow of the night shift, welders, riveters, and machinists worked without pause. Women in bandanas guided steel plates under hydraulic presses. Engineers calibrated assembly lines to produce tanks, jeeps, and aircraft with mathematical precision. What Germany built by hand, America built by the thousands. Every hour somewhere in the United States, another bomber rolled off a line, another tank clattered from a rail car, another freighter slipped into the sea. The arsenal of democracy was awake, and it was coming for Europe. Even the weather conspired against the defenders. The fog that cloaked the Normandy coast, what had seemed a shield, became a weapon for the invaders. Under its cover, the Allies advanced unseen, guided by radar and radio beacons. American soldiers, drenched and exhausted, moved with an unspoken confidence. They had been told that the fate of the free world rested on their shoulders, and somehow they believed it. German officers watching from their command posts wondered what drove them. Fear? Duty? Faith? The truth was more complex. It was the collective force of an entire nation, millions working in unison, bound by purpose. As the days turned into weeks, the realization began to dawn like a slow sunrise over the ruins of occupied France. The Wehrmacht was fighting not just an army, but an idea of abundance, precision, and inevitability. Every time the Germans thought they had broken the enemy's back, the Americans returned stronger. Entire bridges destroyed by retreating engineers would be rebuilt within days. Convoys destroyed by bombing would reappear on new roads before dawn. It was as if destruction itself could not keep pace with American creation. By late June, German intelligence analysts compiled their first estimates of Allied strength. The numbers were staggering. Over 2 million men already committed, 10,000 aircraft in rotation, 20,000 vehicles moving supplies. For every tank Germany fielded, America could field 5. For every artillery shell fired by the Reich, the Allies could answer with 20. And the replacement chain, men, weapons, even fuel, was endless. Somewhere deep inside every German headquarters, an unspoken thought took root. This was a war mathematics could no longer favor them in. That night, as another rainstorm swept, across the front, Rommel stood by the window of his command post. The horizon flickered with distant fire, the sky trembling with the drone of engines. He thought of the Atlantic Wall, years of labor, millions of tons of concrete, already breached and crumbling. He thought of his men, brave but dwindling, and of the enemy, who seemed to draw strength from the very earth. Then he looked down at the report in his hand, another division lost, another line broken, and felt the first tremor of realization that had haunted German command ever since. They were facing a nation that could not be exhausted, a machine that could not be broken, an enemy that, for the first time in the war, could not be defeated. And this realization was only the beginning. The days following the landings in Normandy revealed the secret that the German generals could not grasp, the sheer scale of American industrial power, refined into a strategic weapon that could not be disrupted or worn down. What Rommel and his staff did not understand, and what the Allies had come to realize after years of bitter conflict, was that the war would not be won by superior generals or tactical brilliance alone. It would be won by supply lines that never faltered, by technology that could turn the tide of a battle in moments, and by sheer numbers that no army, not even the Wehrmacht, could match. At the heart of this revolution in warfare lay the United States' ability to mobilize and innovate at a pace that defied the Axis understanding of war itself. The P-51 Mustang, a sleek fighter designed for long-range operations, was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of American ingenuity. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could reach speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour, striking deep into enemy territory with a range that stretched to 1,600 miles. Its presence in the skies above Normandy was overwhelming, as the Luftwaffe, already crippled by the continuous raids on its airfields, was unable to maintain even a semblance of air superiority. The Mustang, along with its companion, the B-17 Flying Fortress, swept through the skies like a storm, cutting down German aircraft and forcing them into retreat. In mere hours, it was clear. The Luftwaffe was no longer a credible threat. On the ground, It wasn't just the sheer firepower of the Allied forces that made the Germans pause, it was the logistics that underpinned it. The United States, along with its British allies, had built an unprecedented infrastructure that ensured every soldier on the ground had what he needed, when he needed it. It wasn't just a matter of numbers, it was the speed at which the Americans could mobilize their forces. Fuel, food, ammunition, and medical supplies, these were the lifeblood of an army, and the Allies brought it in waves. In the weeks after the invasion, the Americans poured resources into France faster than the Germans could destroy them. Where Rommel once commanded vast networks of railways and transport routes, he now watched helplessly as hundreds of trucks carried essential supplies across treacherous terrain, delivering them directly to the front lines. Even more devastating than the supply lines was the innovation in American military technology that was rapidly becoming apparent. One of the most crucial advantages was the Sherman tank, a medium tank that, while not the heaviest or most powerful on the battlefield, had a distinct advantage in numbers. The M4 Sherman was a workhorse, easy to produce in vast quantities and adaptable to any battlefield condition. Its 75mm gun could fire high-explosive shells that devastated German infantry and soft targets, while its simple design meant that the tanks could be repaired quickly, even under fire. Over 49,000 Shermans would be built, flooding the battlefields of Europe and North Africa. They were the backbone of the Allied armored forces, and their numbers overwhelmed the Axis, who could field far fewer tanks and had limited resources for repairing their damaged machines. But it wasn't just the tanks that defined American innovation. It was also the use of radar. The Allies, particularly the British and Americans, had cracked the secrets of radar technology, allowing them to see the unseen. The Germans, relying on traditional methods of reconnaissance, found themselves utterly blind to the precision strikes that rained down on them from the sky. Radar-guided bombing runs allowed the Allies to hit German infrastructure with devastating accuracy. Even in the dead of night, American bombers could navigate through clouds and poor visibility, turning German cities into firestorms. As the war dragged on, the effectiveness of these radar-guided bombs only improved, with each strike eroding the Nazi war machine from the inside. One of the most significant moments of the Normandy campaign came on June 12, 1944, during the Battle of Carentan. It was here that the true power of American coordination and technical superiority would be fully realized. The battle began at dawn, with American forces advancing under the cover of artillery fire and the constant roar of P-47 Thunderbolts strafing the German positions. The Germans, caught off guard by the speed of the American assault, were forced into a hasty defense. They sent out tanks, hoping to use their superior armor to slow the American advance. But the Americans were ready. For the first time, they used the newly developed proximity fuses in their artillery shells, allowing their shells to explode in the air just above the tanks, sending deadly shrapnel raining down upon them. At the same time, a fleet of Sherman tanks, their crews protected by a network of communication lines and air support, advanced under a fog of smoke and dust. As they neared the German positions, they unleashed a barrage of fire, the 75mm shells ripping through the German armor. The battle, though brief, was a decisive victory for the Americans, with the Germans losing over 2,000 men and 60 tanks. The Americans, by contrast, suffered less than 500 casualties and lost only a handful of tanks. The difference in numbers, logistics, and technology was stark. In the aftermath of the battle, German officers could not deny the truth any longer. The Americans were not just overwhelming them with numbers. They were overwhelming them with a new kind of warfare, one that combined logistics, technology, and industrial might in a way the Germans could not replicate. They had expected the Americans to be disorganized, lacking the discipline of the German Wehrmacht. Instead, they were met with an army that was precise, disciplined, and unfathomably well-equipped. And it wasn't just one battle. The same story was being written across Europe, from Italy to the beaches of Normandy, and soon into the heart of Germany itself. But the battle for Carentan wasn't just a turning point for the Allies. It was a moment of realization for the German generals. They could no longer fight a war of attrition. The American forces were not bound by the same limitations that had plagued Germany for years. Their industrial base was unshakable, their technological advantage growing by the day, and their will to win fueled by a nation that had turned war into a full-scale national effort. The Germans, by contrast, were fighting on borrowed time, their resources stretched thin and their morale at an all-time low. In the quiet of their headquarters, German officers began to realize the unthinkable. They had lost the ability to fight a war of attrition. The Americans, for the first time, had shown them that they were facing an enemy that could not be defeated. And as the battle lines shifted, and the Allies pressed forward into the heart of Europe, it was clear the tide of the war had irrevocably turned. As the war ground on through the summer and into the fall of 1944, the realization that America could not be defeated began to haunt German command at every level. The Germans, who had once believed in the superiority of their doctrine, speed, surprise, and devastating force, now saw those principles falter under the weight of an industrial machine they could not match. The Allied momentum was undeniable, and the psychological toll it took on the German war effort was profound. In the wake of Normandy, the Allies pushed relentlessly toward the heart of France, and with every inch of ground they gained, the Germans saw their own fortunes dim further. As the Americans rolled through the French countryside, they encountered not just German soldiers, but a shattered civilian population whose morale had been ground into dust under years of occupation. In Paris, when the Allied forces liberated the city on August 25, 1944, the streets erupted into joy. The German officers, who had once seen the city as a symbol of their dominance, could only watch from the shadows as the Allied flags rose above the Arc de Triomphe. For the Germans, it was not just a city lost. It was the symbol of a crumbling empire, one that had failed to break the spirit of the people it sought to control. But the true significance of the Normandy invasion went beyond territory captured or cities liberated. The psychological impact on the German High Command was immense. General Alfred Jodl, the chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, admitted in post-war interrogations that the Americans' unrelenting ability to resupply and reinforce their troops had completely shattered their earlier assumptions about the war. The belief that the Americans would tire, that the vast distances and the brutal nature of warfare would slow them down, had been completely wrong. The Allied soldiers fought with a grim determination, bolstered by the knowledge that their industrial base was ever ready to supply them with what they needed. It wasn't just the weapons that kept the Americans moving, it was the certainty that there was always more where that came from. This certainty was something the Germans could no longer afford. The American soldiers in France knew that for every battle they fought, they could count on new tanks, new planes, and fresh supplies. As a result, their morale remained high even as the casualties piled up. For the Germans, the reverse was true. Their supply lines, already stretched thin, began to falter. Their tanks were outdated, their aircraft outnumbered. The industrial base that had once been the backbone of Nazi Germany was now being obliterated by Allied bombing raids, many of which were guided by the very radar technology the Germans had underestimated. The once vaunted German tank divisions, like the Panther and Tiger, had become shadowy remnants of their former selves, weighed down by mechanical failures and lack of fuel. In the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge, which would prove to be one of Germany's last major offensives, German morale reached a new low. The Germans, in a final attempt to slow the Allies' advance, launched a desperate counter-offensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. At first, it seemed that the Germans had achieved some degree of success, pushing back the American forces and capturing key positions. But within days, the Allies had regrouped and retaliated. The tanks and artillery that had made the Germans so formidable were met with waves of fresh American reinforcements, and the offensive collapsed. The psychological damage to the Germans was severe. They had gambled everything on a last-ditch attempt to break the American line and had failed miserably. This moment marked a turning point, not just in terms of strategy, but in the psyche of the German generals. They had lost the ability to control the war. They had lost the ability to outlast their enemies. In the months that followed, the psychological impact of the American industrial juggernaut only deepened. The Germans could no longer hide their fear of the inevitable. The war had become a race to the bottom, a battle not of armies but of economies. As American bombers continued to rain destruction on German factories and infrastructure, the myth of German invincibility shattered completely. The country that had once been the world's industrial powerhouse, with an army that had swept across Europe in lightning-fast campaigns, was now at the mercy of an enemy that had learned how to build faster, fight harder, and supply with an efficiency that left the Germans with no room to maneuver. For the Germans, the writing was on the wall. As the Allies liberated territory, including the key industrial areas of the Ruhr, they found themselves confronted not just by an enemy in retreat, but by a once mighty war machine that had ground itself into dust. The realization that America could not be defeated had become for the Germans an unshakable truth. And it was this truth that would shape their final days of fighting. But it was also a truth that would shape the post-war world. The legacy of the American war machine, the mass production, the technological innovations, and the logistical expertise became a defining feature of the Cold War era. The ability to fight a war on a global scale, to move vast quantities of men and material with unprecedented speed, would become the foundation of America's superpower status. The lessons learned in World War II were not just about military tactics. They were about the power of industry and innovation. The Americans had proven that war could be won not just on the battlefield, but in the factories, on the assembly lines, and through the relentless drive of a nation committed to victory. In the years that followed, the world would come to terms with the impact of the war. The post-war economic boom would forever alter the global landscape, and the innovations developed during the war would become the building blocks of modern technology. The rise of the United States as the world's dominant superpower was assured, and the lessons of World War II, the power of industrial mobilization, the importance of technological innovation, and the value of relentless resolve would echo through every conflict that followed. And as the war ended, as the Allies marched into Berlin, the final defeat of Nazi Germany marked not just the end of an era, but the beginning of a new one where the power of industrial might, not military genius, would define the future. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower reflected, "The Americans have not won this war with men alone, nor have they won it with weapons alone. It was the result of something more, the unmatched ability to fight a war by assembling all the pieces into something far greater than the sum of its parts." And in the end, that was the lesson Germany had learned too late. America's power lay not just in its military might, but in its ability to turn the very concept of war into something that could not be defeated.